Hi! In this video I will show you my process of printing and finishing helmets. I will showcase my workflow with the Mandalorian Imperial Super Commando file, which you can purchase in my Etsy shop. You can find the link to my shop as well as my Instagram page in the video description. First, let's take a look at what you get after purchasing the Imperial Super Commando helmet. Once the purchase is complete, you will receive a .txt with a link to download the folder you need. In the folder that you can download are the 3D files for the helmet, the download link, again, a picture of all the parts and where they go, as well as print setting recommendations. Let's start by slicing the files and preparing them for 3D printing. So here we are in Cheeto Box, which is the 3D slicer I use for my resin printer, and I just drag and drop all of the files that I want to print onto the platform. As you can see, the scaling is not accurate, so you bring it up to the scale that you want. Now we want to space them out evenly so we can all print them in one go. I'm still kind of new to resin printing, but there are many good tutorials on YouTube. If you're also starting with resin printing, just look for the slicer you have, and there's a lot of good videos on how to get started. A trick that I've heard is that you want to have the model at a 30-degree angle. You know, this is kind of offset. Regularly, 30 degrees is a good place to start. You tend to angle them because if you move the slider down, you can see how the model is being printed. And this is a very big area that's getting printed all at once that might just stick to the fab sheet and not to the print plate, which is risky. And here you can see it's a smaller area, so less risk of it getting stuck, failing the print. That's why you rotate your models. If you have positioned them nicely, the next step that I tend to do is I select all of them with the button up here. You can select all, and then I hollow them out. I use a wall thickness of 2.1 millimeters. Hit start, and it's generating for all the parts. This, as you can see, they're all hollow now. This saves a lot of material and money. With that being done, we can go over to the support menu. And what I like to do, I use auto support as a starting point. Again, you have different kind of supports. You have heavy, medium, and light. And here you have a little preview of what they look like. I always use medium because the heavy supports leave too many marks when you remove them. And the light supports, I had a lot of prints fail. That's why I stick to medium. You have parameters on how the supports look. Again, I'm not too sure how to properly set them. I'm still getting used to this. I'm still learning. So I had pretty good results with this. If you want, you can take a screenshot and copy these settings. But again, there's good tutorials on YouTube. Now all I gotta do is hit plus all. This is gonna generate the supports for all the parts. All of the parts are supported. If you look from the bottom up, the supports are being hidden so you can see what's going on. Now we can go in and correct everything where we think it's not enough supports. For example, I would add a few supports. Right here you can add supports, remove supports, or edit supports. We want to add supports. Here, for example, give it a couple more for more stability. Also right here, this is an overhang that I would like to have supported just to be sure. Same goes for this one. And then you just go over all the parts, all the edges, and make sure that they are properly supported. I'd rather have too many supports than too little. Also a nice tip, try to add the supports on the side that are not on the outside of the model. For example, right here, you can see this teeth part. This is the side that will be visible, and the sides where the supports are added is on the inside of the helmet, so you will not see the marks. Same goes for the earpieces. The antenna are a little more tricky, but resin can easily be sanded, so don't worry about that. And that's all. You can go back to this, to the model settings, hit slice. This is gonna take a few seconds. There we are. You see the time, price, and how much volume you need, how much resin, and you get a preview of what the print will look like. Then you save it to the file and send it off to your printer. And that's it. So right now I am in Cura. Cura is the slicing software that I primarily use for my FDM printing. We just drag and drop the file into Cura, and there's our helmet. As you can see, it's way too small because Maya has different scale settings, but that's not a problem because we can scale it up. First thing I would do though is rotate it into the position that you would want to wear it. So that's upright. This little indicator here shows you that this is the front. If it's the front left, you know that you are looking at the printer head on. So now that we have rotated the helmet into the right position, let's scale it up. Make sure that uniform scaling is checked, so that if you scale into one direction, the others will copy that. If you put the setting off, like I did right now, you will deform the helmet, which is not what we want. So uniform scaling stays on. Very important. Now, before you print, make sure to measure your head or have an idea of how big your head is. Other helmets that I printed are about 22 centimeters wide. So let's start with that. For this helmet, however, I think this will be too small. For as you can see, it's not very big. There's a lot of space that gets lost because of the cheeks that fall in with Mandalorian helmets. So I would scale this up even further. Also, you can see the other axis. The y-axis is 22.6 centimeters, which is not enough. You know, my personal recommendation if I would want to wear it is 250 millimeters. That should be sufficient. You can also see the helmet is about 29 centimeters or almost 30 centimeters high, which is also good. So now we have the scale figured out. Other files will have to have the exact same size or they will not fit. With that done, let's move on to the printer settings. In Cura, here is the box, this box right here. For the quality, the layer height is how thick one layer is. If you hover over the name, it will give you a description of what that actually does, of what the setting is. I have it set to 0.32 millimeters, which is the biggest setting that my nozzle allows. I have a 0.2 millimeter nozzle, which is the nozzle that comes with the printer. I still use the same nozzle, it's still working well. 0.32 millimeters is the maximum layer height. Then wall thickness is something I've never really changed. 2 wall lines is sufficient, it always works. Never had problems with this, so why change it? Top and bottom layer, however, is a bit of a different story. It depends on what you're printing. For helmets, I would say 3 bottom layers is enough. Top layers, 3, maybe 4. We're gonna check that out later though, and see if 3 will be sufficient. Infill, 20%. Perfect. Material, I have the temperature set to 210 degrees Celsius and the build plate to 65 Celsius. This depends on the material that you're printing with. Right now, I think I'm using the Amazon Basics PLA, and I had good experiences with these settings, but there should be a little info card on the material itself where it says from this temperature to this temperature will get you the best experiences. So just keep an eye out for that and change your settings accordingly. The speed, 70 millimeters per second. I sped it up a bit. I think 50 is default. Let's see. Yeah, 50 is default. Also, if you click on this little arrow here, it will turn the setting back to default settings. I keep it at 70 because, you know, it's a bit faster and I have good experiences. Travel, I really recommend testing these settings for traveling. I only changed these because I had problems with stringing, so I changed them. I watched some videos online about how to get rid of stringing, and this is a recommended setting. I'm not having the best results, but it's definitely improved. Cooling, 100%, never touched that. Supports will have to be on. Make sure you have supports turned on for this model. As you can see, everything that's marked red is an area that would be supported, and the printer can't print mid-air, so you need supports. Support structure normal, support placement everywhere. Basic settings, we keep it like that. It's good. Overhang angle, again, depends on your printer. Make sure to test it first. For me, 60 works fine. And support density 5% is also enough. Build plate adhesion, I never use that. I always have it turned off. If you need it, if you have better experiences with build plate adhesion, feel free. I leave it off. Dual extrusion, my printer can't do that, and experimental is experimental, so we're not going to dig into that right now. So the sliced file looks still the same because we're still in prepare and not preview. We're going to move on to preview in a second. But let's take a look. It says it will take 3 days, 11 hours and 44 minutes, which is a lot. And it will take about 1 kilogram of filament, which is an entire spool. But as you can see right here, there's a huge area that needs support. Let's have a look. Click on preview to see the layers. It will give you a preview of what the model will look like with supports, so you can make a decision of whether you want to keep the supports or change them, because we want to change them. As you can see, this is all sufficient. That's good. Works for me. Very nice. But this one right here, we do not want that. In order to get rid of it, we see it's right here. It's formed at the top of the dome of the helmet, because, you know, it's an overhang angle which is higher than 60 degrees, so it wants to set a support. We don't need a support right there. It will look a bit messy on the inside, but it's the inside. No one will ever see that. So what we're going to do is in the sidebar here, there's an option support blocker. You click on that and click on the model. It will give you this tiny cube. This cube we will then scale up and move it upwards. So in the back here you can see these little lines in the helmet. These need support, so make sure you place the blocker. If you have details like this on your helmet, make sure to place the support blocker higher than these details. Otherwise you will block the supports for the details, and you don't want that. If we click slice again, with the support blocker, if you look underneath, you can see no more supports are generated right here, and it saved us about a day of printing time. Now, some people like to lay the model flat on the ground, because right now, as you can see, we have an angle at the base of the helmet. Some people like to put this flat. Now, keep in mind, this is 2 days and 14 hours. Let's rotate the model. You want to make sure that it's rotated almost flat to the surface. With this model it doesn't work because it has these little teeth in the front, but you want to get it as close as possible. Hit slice again, and you notice maybe the support blocker moved with the model. It's parented to the model, so it will move with the model, which is really handy. You can see 2 days and 18 hours, so it's 4 hours more printing time, because as you can see in the back, there's more supports in the back for the detail that I have. This doesn't mean that the helmet that you will model necessarily has the same issue, but for this model right here, I will print it upright because it's faster and it needs less material. So, Ctrl Z to get it back to what it was. You see right here, this area, this is not supported. I don't like that. So what we're gonna do is I have a new setting enabled, which is custom supports. If you wanna have custom settings, there's a lot of settings you can change. I recommend watching a tutorial on Cura because I'm not really that deep into it. Okay, so custom supports, just a normal cylinder, and you can set the size of this thing. 10 millimeters is a bit overkill. But as I said, I'd rather have too much than not enough. Now you just click on where you want the supports to be and hit slice again. It's done slicing, and now you can have a more in-depth look at it to see if there's any errors, anything you want to change. So to have a closer look, on the side you have this slider that you can use to show all the different layers. From layer 1 all the way to layer 927. That's how many layers I have. Let's start at the bottom. And yeah, you just scroll along and you kind of check all the supported areas that you have and see how they look. Now we can take a look at the top of the model and see if the bottom layers are sufficient. If you go down, We have 3 top layers. And that should be enough to close the model off. 921st layer is the one that closes the helmet off. And then we have until layer 927 to finish the helmet. That's 6 layers. That's more than enough to close this hole on top. Alright, that's it. If you're wondering what printer I'm using, I have a Creality CR-10S. Very happy with that printer. That's about it. For Cura, you do the same for all the other models. You know, different models have different needs for supports, or density, or infill. Just make sure to check everything before you print it to ensure that you only have to print the model once and don't have to reprint, because that's a waste of time and material. So take this step serious, make sure to look at everything, don't forget anything, and then print. After printing is done and the supports are removed, I take the helmet over to my workbench. I start coating it with UV resin using a brush. Make sure to wear gloves and a respirator when working with UV resin. You don't want to get it on your skin or breathe in the fumes. I evenly brush on thin layers of resin. Be careful not to let the resin run, drip, or collect in seams and corners of the helmet. I coat one area with resin and then use a UV flashlight to cure the resin. Once hardened, I move on to the next area. This way, I avoid fingerprints in the resin and I don't get too much uncured resin on my gloves. After the helmet is covered in resin, I put it out in the sun. The natural UV light of the sun will help to cure the resin completely. Once the entire helmet is fully cured, I use 120 to 180 grit sandpaper to sand all of the surfaces to get rid of the imperfections and layer lines. This is the hardest part of the entire process, as it takes a long time and is pretty exhausting for your hands and wrists. I take my time to sand all of the surfaces evenly. As you will see, one coat is not enough, so after carefully and thoroughly sanding, I apply a second thin coat of resin. For the second resin layer, I tried using a sponge brush to apply the resin. For big flat surfaces, this worked well, but for more detailed parts, I switched back to the regular brush. The brush that I use here is an old brush, and after this, I cannot use this brush with anything else, so make sure not to use an expensive brush, because the resin will ruin the brush. I basically repeat everything I did for the first layer here. Thin, even layers, don't let it run, drip, or collect in corners. And we're back to sanding. I bought the sanding machine to give my hands and wrists a break, but it turned out that doing it by hand had the better result. So I sanded everything again. I did use the machine from time to time just for the bigger and flatter areas, like the dome on top and the face area, but in the back for the details, I used my hands. Now onto one of the more fun parts of this project. After coating and sanding the helmet twice, I now use filler primer to spray the entire helmet with it. It makes it easier to see which areas need more work. The filler primer also fills in little gaps and layer lines. Make sure to use spray paint in a well-ventilated area and wear a respirator. After priming the entire helmet, the next step is sanding it down, which I forgot to film. I'm very sorry about that. Here you can see me applying a second thick coat of primer to the helmet. A very thick layer because we want all the leftover layer lines to be filled. After the second primer coat has dried, I used Bondo to fill bigger gaps that the primer could not close. Bondo is a filler putty, often used for cars. It has a toothpaste-like texture and is very helpful for prop making. It is important to wear gloves for this part. Some people use tools to apply Bondo, but I prefer to use my fingers. Don't worry about putting it on too thick. Once dried, it can be sanded away easily. Take your time with this step. If you want, you can cover the entire helmet with Bondo. Don't forget to cover the edges of the bottom of the helmet, as well as the edges around the visor. Once you covered everything with Bondo, let it dry for about 2 hours. Once it's fully dried, you can move on to the next step, which is sanding. Sanding again. To sand the more detailed parts, I wrapped 180 grit sandpaper around a stick. I know I say that a lot, but take your time with sanding. It will be noticeable in the end if you rush the sanding process. Trust me, I know. I'm not only going over the parts where I applied Bondo, but over the entire helmet. All the layers of PLA, resin, primer and Bondo are supposed to blend into another to create a smooth and even surface. Don't worry if the PLA becomes visible while sanding. From time to time, I brush away the dust to see which areas need more work. To get into the lines that go around the helmet, I fold the sandpaper and use the edge, which worked better than expected. Because Bondo stays soft for some time, you can use tools to carve finer details that have been covered by a Bondo, like the circle in the back of the helmet. In this case, I used a nail. Check the entire helmet if all the areas that needed work are sanded down to the point that you're happy with it. Use a brush to remove all the dust before painting. Yes, you heard that right, painting. But before we can do that, one last coat of primer. I ran out of the white primer, so I used the black one. If possible, I recommend to use any kind of spray paint outside. The weather was not great the last week, so I had to spray most coats inside, not this one though. Cover the entire helmet with primer. Again, make sure not to spray too much at once, so the paint does not drip or run. The base coat is important, to have a consistent background color to paint onto. If you skip this step, there is a chance your paint job will end up patchy, and we don't want that. Now it is also time to paint the details that I printed on my resin printer. They too get a black base coat. For the second color I used silver. This step I would say is optional, but if you want to add details like chipped off paint, it is good to have the silver underneath. Same goes for the other parts. A nice coat of silver. Now that the base coats are done, it is time to think about how you want to paint your helmet. In my case, I want to paint it the way it is seen in the show. I printed this picture and put it on the wall for reference while painting. There are 3 colors that I need to paint: light gray, white and red. Here I start with the light gray, that will be on the cheeks and on the back of the helmet. Even though only some parts are gray, I paint the entire helmet to prevent the next layer from being patchy. I also paint the resin printed details with the white coat. A very thin coat, not to put too much color on at once. The next layer for the helmet will be white, and because I want the cheeks to stay gray, I use masking tape to cover all the areas that are supposed to stay gray. Thin strips of tape make it easier to work on curved edges. But because I do not have thin tape like that, I use an X-Acto knife to cut thin strips of my tape and use those, which worked well. Once the areas are outlined, I fill the area with tape and make sure there are no holes. I also use my fingers and nails to really stick the tape on the surface. Wrinkles in the tape can cause paint to run under the tape. I repeat the same process on the other side. You can see me using an X-Acto knife to cut the tape on the helmet. Be careful when you do this. You do not want to cut into the paint or the helmet. Next, I masked off the back of the helmet. To get the shape right, I put down some tape and mark where I need to cut, using a Sharpie. Then taking the tape off and cut it with some scissors. I sped up this process for you. All this took me over an hour. Now that everything is taped off, I seal it with a coat of gray. Once this is dried, I go over the entire helmet with a matte white. Again, painting on thin layers at a time. I put on 3 to 4 coats of white. While I wait for the paint to dry, let's check out the side details. Remember when I said to put on thin coats? Yeah, the last coat was too thick and the paint started to wrinkle up. Not that bad, but this could have been avoided. Now comes one of the most rewarding parts of the whole project, peeling off the paint. I try to pull evenly and slowly, not to rip off the paint underneath, which did happen at this one corner. I think while masking I went a little too heavy with the X-Acto knife. However, I am so happy with how this is going. There is one more color that needs to be painted, and this is the red arrow. I tried to film how I put on the tape, but all you could see was my head, so I left that part out. But basically, I put down some tape on a flat surface from which I could remove the tape easily. Then I draw the shape of the arrow and use an X-Acto knife to cut out and remove the tape and place it on the helmet. I also taped off the teeth pieces and forgot to hit record, but this is how it looks. To prevent from having to tape off the entire helmet again, I use a plastic bag with a hole in it to cover the helm before painting. I sealed off the mask again with a thin coat of white and then sprayed the arrow red and the teeth dark grey. Back at the desk, I removed the masking tape from the dried teeth pieces. This time I was too fast to peel the tape off and removed the paint in parts altogether. No worries, I can fix this later, but this is a reminder to take it slow when removing masking tape. Now it is also time to glue the antenna pieces to the side details. Making sure they are straight, I set them aside to let the glue cure. In the meantime, the red paint has dried and I can remove the plastic bag and tape to see how it looks. Some red did bleed through, nothing major, it's fine. The last thing we need to do for this project is add the visor. I use this face shield and put some dark window foil over it. Some makers like to work with a visor cutout to find the right shape, that's why I added a template to the 3D files, but I like to eyeball this part. With the visor cut, I can now use my hot glue gun to glue the visor in place. Be careful not to burn yourself like I did several times. Hold the visor in place while the glue cools down. I like to work from the bottom up to prevent the visor from stretching. And that's it. The helmet is done. Now it's time to enjoy the finished helmet. Thank you so much for choosing to watch this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and it gave you an idea of the process if you want to make a helmet yourself. If you enjoyed the video, let me know by liking this video. Maybe even consider subscribing. And don't forget to check out my Etsy and Instagram pages. The links are in the description. I hope to see you in the next one. Have a great day.